would probably be a very remarkable Indian at her party, a Brahmin from Benares," she said. "I should like to have a talk with him while I'm having my tea. Kindly prepare a peach for me, Miss Lyall." Peppino had heard about the retirement of the Guru in consequence of a message from the guides being expected, and proceeded to explain this to Lady Ambermere, who did not take the slightest notice as she was looking at the peaches through her lorgnette. "That one nearest to me looks eatable," she said. "And then I do not see Miss Olga Bracely, though I distinctly told her I should be here this afternoon, and she said Mrs. Lucas had asked her. She sang to us yesterday evening at the Hall, and very creditably indeed. Her husband, Mr. Shuttleworth, is a cousin of the late lord's." Lucia had come into the smoking parlour during this speech, and heard these fatal words. At the moment she would gladly have recalled her invitation to Olga Bracely altogether, sooner than have alluded therein to Mr. Bracely. But that was one of the irremediable things of life, and since it was no use wasting regret on that, she was only the more eager for Olga to come, whatever her husband's name was. She braced herself up to the situation. "Peppino, are you looking after Lady Ambermere?" she said. "Dear Lady Ambermere, I hope they are all taking care of you." "A very decent peach," said Lady Ambermere. "The south wall of my garden is covered with them, and they are always of peculiarly delicious flavour. The Hall is famed for its peaches. I understood that Miss Bracely was going to be here, Mrs. Lucas. I cannot imagine what makes her so late. I was always famed for my punctuality myself. I have finished my tea." The lawn outside was now growing thick with people all in their Hightums, and Lady Ambermere, as she emerged from the smoking parlour, again viewed the scene with marked disfavour. The two Miss Antrobuses had just arrived, and skipped up to their hostess with pretty cries. "We are dreadfully late," said the eldest, "but it was all Piggy's fault." "No, Goosey, it was yours," said the other. "How can you be so naughty as to say it was mine? Dear Mrs. Lucas, what a lovely party it's being, and may we go and play bowls?" Lady Ambermere regarded their retreating backs as they raced off with arms intertwined to the bowling green. "And who are those young ladies?" she asked, "and why Piggy and Goosey? Miss Lyall, do not let Pug go to the bowls. They are very heavy." Elsewhere Mrs. Antrobus was slowly advancing from group to group, with her trumpet violently engaged in receiving refreshment. But conversation was not quite so varied as usual, for there was an attitude of intense expectation with regard to the appearance of Miss Bracely that made talk rather jerky and unconnective. Then also it had gone about that the mysterious Indian, who had been seen now and then during the last week, was actually staying with Mrs. Lucas. And why was he not here? More unconjecturable yet, though not so thrillingly interesting, was the absence of Mr. Georgie. What could have happened to him that he was not flitting about on his hostess's errands, and being the life and soul of the party? It was in vain that Mrs. Antrobus plodded on her methodical course, seeking answers to all these riddles, and that Mrs. Weston, in her swifter progression, dashed about in her bath chair from group to group, wherever people seemed to be talking in an animated manner. She could learn nothing, and Mrs. Antrobus could learn nothing. In fact, the only information to be had on the subject was what Mrs. Weston herself supplied. She had a very high-coloured, handsome face, and an extremely impressive manner, as if she was imparting information of the very highest importance. She naturally spoke in a loud, clear voice, so that she had not got to raise it much even when she addressed Mrs. Antrobus. Her wealth of discursive detail was absolutely unrivalled, and she was quite the best observer in Riseholme. "The last I saw of Miss Bracely," she said, exactly as if she had been told to describe something on oath in the witness box, "was a little after 1:30 today. It must have been after 1:30, because when I got home it was close on 1:45, and I wasn't 100 yards from my house when I saw her. As soon as I saw her, I said to my gardener boy, Henry Luton, who was pushing me, he's the son of old Mrs. Luton, who kept the fish shop, and when she died last year, I began to get my fish from Brinton, for I didn't fancy the look of the new person who took on the business, and Henry went to live with his aunt. That was his father's sister, not his mother's, for Mrs. Luton never had a sister, and no brothers either. Well, I said to Henry, 'You can go a bit slower, Henry. As we're late, and a minute or two more doesn't make any difference.' 'No, ma'am,' said Henry, touching his cap. So we went slower. Miss Bracely was just opposite the ducking pond then, and presently she came out between the elms. She had just an ordinary morning frock on. It was dark blue, about the same shade as your cape, Mrs Antrobus, or perhaps a little darker, for the sunshine brightened it up. Quite simple it was, nothing grand. And she looked at the watch on her wrist, and seemed to me to walk a little quicker after that, as if she was a bit late, just as I was. But slower than I was going I could not go, for I was crawling along, and before she got off the grass I'd come to the corner of Church Lane, and though I turned my head round sharp like that at the very last moment, so as to catch the last of her, she hadn't more than stepped off the grass onto the road before the laurestinus on the corner of Colonel Boucher's garden, no, of the vicar's garden, hid her from me, and if you ask me—" Mrs Weston stopped for a moment, nodding her head up and down to emphasize the importance of what she had said, and to raise the expectations of Mrs Antrobus to the highest pitch as to what was coming. "And if you ask me where I think she was going and what she was going to do," she said, "I believe she was going out to lunch, and that she was going to one of those houses there, just across the road, for she made a bee-line across the green towards them. Well, there are 3 houses there. There's Mrs Quantock's, and it couldn't have been that, or else Mrs Quantock would have some news of her. Or Colonel Boucher's, and it wouldn't have been that, for the Colonel would have had news of her. And we all know whose the 3rd house just there is." Mrs Antrobus had not completely followed this powerful reasoning. "But Colonel Boucher and Mrs Quantock are both here, eh?" said she. Mrs Weston raised her voice a little. "That's what I'm saying," she announced. "But who isn't here whom we should expect to see, and where's his house?" It was generally felt that Mrs Weston had hit the nail on the head. What that nail precisely was no one knew, because she had not explained why both Olga Bracely and Georgie were absentees. But now came the climax, bang on the top of the nail, a shrewd straight stroke. "So there she was, having her lunch with Mr Georgie," said Mrs Weston, now introducing this name for the first time, with the highest dramatic art, "and they would be seeing round his house afterwards. And then, when it was time to come here, Mr Georgie would have remembered that the party was Hightum, not Tightum, and there was Miss Bracely not in Hightum at all, nor even Tightum, in my opinion, but Scrub. 'No doubt,' she said to him, 'is it a very grand sort of party, Mr Pilson?' And he couldn't do other than reply, for we all received notice that it was Hightum, mine came about 12, he couldn't do other than reply, 'Yes, Miss Bracely, it is.' 'Good gracious me,' she would say, 'and I've only got this old rag on. I must go back to the Ambermere Arms, and tell my maid, for she brought a maid in that second motor, and tell my maid to put me out something tidy.' 'But that will be a great bother for you,' he would say, or something of that sort, for I don't pretend to know what he actually did say, and she would reply, 'Oh, Mr Pilson, but I must put on something tidy, and it would be so kind of you if you would wait for me while I do that, and let us go together.' That's what she said." Mrs Weston made a sign to her gardener to proceed, wishing to lead the stage at the moment of climax. "And that's why they're both late," she said, and was whirled away in the direction of the bowling green. The minutes went on, and still nobody appeared who could possibly have accounted for the 3-lined whip of Hightums, but by degrees Lucia, who had utterly failed to decoy Lady Ambermere into the place of thrones, began to notice a certain thinning on her lawns. Her guests, it would seem, were not in process of dispersal, for it was a long way off 7 o'clock yet, and also none would be so ill-mannered as to leave without shaking hands and say what a delicious afternoon they had spent. But certainly the lawns grew emptier, and she was utterly unable to explain this extraordinary phenomenon, until she happened to go close to the windows of her music-room. Then, looking in, she saw that not only was every chair there occupied, but people were standing about in expectant groups. For a moment her heart beat high. Could Olga have arrived and by some mistake have gone straight in there? It was a dream-like possibility, but it burst like a ray of sunshine on the party that